when DA visits somebody, it's generally a record keeping and security review. They're checking for, do your records match what you have on hand that day, and are they complete?
3, 2, 1, liftoff.
Welcome back to the Ketamine Startup Podcast. This is where we dive into all things related to starting and running a ketamine infusion clinic, from practical tips to marketing strategies and much more. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dennis Wichern, who is a retired DEA special agent in charge who now runs a consulting company called Prescription Drug Consulting. He specializes in compliance and regulatory guidance. We cover a ton of ground in this episode, including the risk of getting an audit, the differences between drug destruction and wasting, and so much more. Of course, before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this podcast is for educational purposes only. The views expressed in this episode and those of the speaker do not constitute legal or medical or regulatory advice for your specific practice. So please consult with a professional before making decisions for your business or medical practice. I also learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope you do too. Now, let's jump into the episode. So before we begin with some of the questions, I would love for you, Dennis, to tell us a little bit about your background, kind of give us your bio, if you will, for our viewers and listeners.
I look forward to it, Sam, and thank you again for having me on your show. I joined DEA when I was 27 years old in 1987. I had always a focus on federal law enforcement, and as I often tell people, I choose DEA and they ended up choosing me. Had a number of college degrees and things like that, but I always wanted to do some kind of public service, and I knew DEA would be exciting, interesting, and I always had a goal of trying to help kids and people from getting into the drugs. So that was really my driving force.
And, you were really passionate about the DEA, but did you ever consider going into one of these other, agencies, whether it's the FBI or CIA or military? Was that ever something that you considered?
When I look back on that, Sam, I was aware of those other agencies, but I was fortunate enough to get hired by DEA first. And as I learned during my career, every one of those agencies have a different culture, and you really don't know it until you're inside of it. And I could almost have another hour conversation about the way the U.S. Marshals operate versus the FBI, the Secret Service, the ATF, and the CIA, and it's all kind of interesting. Great organizations, all of them. But I was fortunate enough to be hired by DEA, and I ended up getting to the right place.
Excellent. And before you transitioned into working with clinics and physicians and kind of the controlled substances, you were doing some field work, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
You bet. When you start out as a DEA special agent, you start by doing investigations and helping the more senior agents. And when I joined, I was a rookie. I really had no experience. And you start out at the bottom like any new job. It's like you doing your residency and things like that when you did that years ago. I got stuck and I actually welcomed it in a way, but because I was a rookie, I got stuck doing meth lab cases and investigations. None of the other guys wanted to do them. Most of the other guys were married. I was single, and myself and another person ended up doing most of the meth lab breakdowns and the cases and things like that. So when I look back on it, funny. My wife still makes fun of my sense of smell. I always comment, hey, one too many meth labs have thrown off my sense of smell. But I started by doing meth cases, progressed to different cases, nationwide cases, spanning from California across, Arizona cases back to where I was working at the time in Missouri. Got promoted to be a supervisor about 10 years later. About 4 years later, I went to Washington, D.C. and worked at DEA headquarters, which was quite an eye-opening experience. You're interfacing with Congress. You're dealing with a lot of heavy issues. And then once I got out of there, about 4 years later, I went into Indiana as the agent in charge. And that's where I became, in 2005, front and center on the pharmaceutical controlled substance part of DEA. And the reason back then is, I often tell people, we were not Kentucky or West Virginia back then in 2005, but we had our own serious issue of emerging pill mills. And at that time, my regulatory group was somewhat floundering, and that's where I devoted time for the next 10 years, just working on that part of DEA. And what I learned too, Sam, to answer your question, I also became kind of the chief DEA interfacing with the healthcare providers and organizations, because during that time, they had a lot of questions on why we were doing certain things in the field. And then I'd reach out, and they reached out to me, and I would explain why we were doing what we're doing. And really what it exposed is, as good as DEA is as an organization, it left much to be desired with its interface with all the many great providers, the almost 2 million of them around the country, why DEA does what they do, what's DEA's role in the practice of medicine, what should we look out for, what's red flags and things like that. So that's what I did in 2005, and I continue to do it to today.
Thank you for that excellent background. I don't think this is one of the questions that I had sent you, but the DEA is a relatively newer organization. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it started in 1973 after the Controlled Substance Act. So what was the kind of, tell us a little bit about the history of the DEA to your knowledge.
No, Sam, you're spot on that too. Great research on that. DEA was formed in 1973. Prior to that, they had a number of other agencies. One was BNDD, Bureau of Narcotic and Dangerous Drugs. And years before that, I think the FDA had some role, predecessor in DEA. But Congress decided to merge it all together into one organization. And they did the same with the CSA. So the CSA was actually made by Congress in 1970. That's the Controlled Substance Act. That's the basis for DEA's authority and its CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, all the little requirements that a provider must follow, especially if they keep controlled substances at their facility. So the CSA was made by Congress, and then a few years later in 73, DEA was organized as the one sole drug agency, and it really collapsed a number of laws into one spot. So if you want to find drug laws and the regulations for being a provider, they're in the DEA regulations. Even though they're made by Congress, many people refer to them as the DEA regs.
Got it. And, I remember I had heard an earlier presentation, and you gave this great example of the relationship or analogy between the banking model and the DEA. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I look forward to it, Sam. Now, this is my belief, but I think I can argue it in a well-argued manner. I believe when they made DEA and the DEA regs that apply to doctors that maintain controlled substances, and these regs are the same for a hospital, a clinic, an ambulatory surgery center, a pharmacy, they're all almost the same. They copied the U.S. banking system. So here's how I'm going to argue that to you. A prescription is very similar, if not identical, to a check. All banks use deposits and withdrawals, okay? We all know our check register and our monthly account, but a deposit is no different than a provider ordering drugs for his ketamine clinic. A withdrawal is no different than that provider administering X amount of ketamine to his or her patient on that day. And in theory, when you get that monthly statement from your bank, it shows you exactly what your balance is. And good record keeping for a ketamine therapy provider should do the same. On any given day, you should know your balance. It should all match up and things like that. And I'd also add, the banks are in a closed system too. In theory, you have a DEA number, just like an ambulatory surgery center or hospital does in a pharmacy. You're in a closed system. You're the only one with that number that's allowed to order drugs from a distributor who has a DEA number. Myself, as a normal citizen, cannot order drugs from one of the big three distributors or one of the other. Only you can, and people licensed by DEA. That's the same in a banking system. And to wind it up, kind of a funny story, a manufacturer and a distributor that actually stores Schedule II drugs, like the ADHD medicines and the opioids, they have to maintain them in an 8-inch thick concrete, steel reinforced vault, just like a bank would. So the similarities are very endless, but it really all comes down to record keeping, and it's pretty much identical. They want to know exactly what you do with your drugs. And if you've got great records, you really have no problem with DEA.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I heard this metaphor about the banking model, and when we open up a bank account, the bank, whether it's Chase or Wells Fargo or Bank of America, they'll say, "Hey, Sam, hey, Dennis, here's your checkbook. Please keep track of your deposits and your withdrawals." And I found it interesting that the DEA does not do that. And they kind of give it the freedom for the individual pharmacy or manufacturer, distributor, or medical clinic or doctor. What are your thoughts on that? Like, why is there no generic template or checkbook, if you will, for providers?
It's a great question, Sam. I think it's because DEA, like many federal agencies, but not all, could do a better job, but they don't like giving out legal advice or opinions on the regulations. So the regulations are made by the agency like DEA, but in the history of DEA doesn't really make the regulations unless Congress tells them to. And then it becomes making a regulation, putting it out in the public, taking comments and things like that. But historically, the best you're going to get from DEA is like, they're going to point you to the reg. They're going to point you to one of their manuals, like the pharmacy manual, the practitioner manual, or one of the other manuals. And they'll never give out an exact form, but they're going to point you to a reg that says your form, however you build it, whether it's paper or electronic, should contain these following items. And that's what the regulation says.
Wonderful. And actually, that leads to my next question, which is, what are the key elements for record keeping and security for clinicians who work not with the Schedule I, doing research, or Schedule II, opioids, fentanyl, morphine, et cetera. But let's say they're just working with Schedule III and IV and maybe V. What are some of those key elements, in your opinion?
Well, great records is number one. You have to have a record showing where the drugs went. Really what it comes down to is every other year you have to do an inventory. And all an inventory is a snapshot in time of what drugs you have in your clinic, either at the beginning or end of that day. So in essence, you're going to count those drugs. And on this date, we have X amount of Valium, we have X amount of ketamine, and we have X amount of something else. Okay. And that needs to be witnessed by another person. The next key record is going to be your dispensing log. And for a ketamine therapy provider, that's really the administration log. That's where you're actually administering the liquid ketamine to that patient while he or she's under your care. All right. And at the end of the day, however much you used on that day on your patients should match the reduction of your inventory on that day. If you have both of those, you're about 80% there, and you've got a great foundation for the record keeping. Now, there's some more things you need to do, of course, but those are the keys. As far as security, Sam, you're not held to the same standard as the manufacturer, the distributor that I mentioned. You have a much lesser burden. And for a practitioner like yourself, the requirement says, and I'm going to quote it, securely locked, substantially constructed cabinet, end of quote. So many people say some small safe, locked room, locked cabinet, whatever. That's the minimum standard. Now, you can always exceed that standard if you like, but that's the minimum standard, and that's been in place for 50 plus years.
Yeah, and it's really nice because these safes are pretty easily available. I mean, there are some really nicely fireproof constructed ones on Amazon. You can get a big size, and I think having double security can be really useful in conjunction with like security cameras. I think that's another thing. I know that's not a requirement, but I think having going above and beyond can sometimes be a marker of that individual of how they do things.
I could not agree any more than what you said there, Sam. That's a smart move.
So, I was listening to one of your earlier interviews on another podcast, and it seemed like the DEA was at one point pretty active in doing, like audits of medical clinics. I guess a couple questions. The first one is like, what do you think the risk is for not a pharmacy, not a manufacturer, but for a medical clinic specializing in ketamine therapy? Like 99, 1%, 0.1%. What are your thoughts on the risk?
I think it's very small, Sam. Percentage wise, I'd say 1/10 out of 1% is the option. And it's probably even smaller than that. DEA diversion, which is that regulatory portion of DEA, it's about 10% of DEA. 90% is the agent side where I came from that focuses on fentanyl and heroin traffickers and Mexican cartels and gangs and things like that. The diversion side just focuses on DEA registrants. They spend most of their time doing audits on manufacturers and distributors. Just alone, those two groups total around 1,300 or 1,400 DEA registrants. And then they also do about every 5 years, they'll do an OTP, an opioid treatment program, to check their records. But really, providers, which total around, last count, just around 2 million. There's about 1.4 million doctors, 90% are MDs, 10% are DOs, and there's just under, the last I checked, 600,000 PAs and NPs. So DA really doesn't go out there. I'm sure we'll get to the question you'll probably have me do down the road is, why would they? And I look forward to that question. But at one point, DEA, when there was a new management at DEA that took over in 2016, we had new leadership come in at DEA headquarters. They specifically told the DEA diversion people, hey, quit visiting MAT, OBOT doctors. And those are the doctors you're aware of that do opioid use disorder, primarily using Suboxone in their offices. And you might say, why did they ever visit them in the first place? Back when Suboxone was first approved by SAMHSA, I believe, in 2004, many of the providers were actually inducting their patients in their office, which required that physician to actually have a supply of Suboxone in his or her office. And they'd actually treat that patient and arrive at the correct dose based off their medical expertise. Well, back then that required, too, the same records that a ketamine therapy provider must keep. But what DEA found out is most of the providers back then generally were not keeping records of their inventory. However, when DEA would go visit them, it would create such a ripple effect that it became somewhat passed around the medical community that DEA was anti-MAT and actually against medication-assisted treatment. So the new managers in 2016 said, hey, this one's hurting us more than it's helping. Even though it was lawful, the optics were bad, and they haven't done one of those in like 8 years. Even though it was lawful and they could do it, the way the law was written, it was just hurting the optics of DEA, and probably DEA had better things to do with their time too. Hindsight being 2020, Sam.
Thank you for that. And so what I'm hearing is that, 1/10 of 1%, so low likelihood. What are some of the varying levels of penalties or restrictions or consequences if there was, ever a physician or clinic with poor record keeping and or other irregularities?
Well, the first penalty for a record-keeping violation, if DEA would respond to a clinic and check the records, because that's their authority. When DEA visits somebody, it's generally a record-keeping and security review. They're checking for, do your records match what you have on hand that day, and are they complete? That is really DEA's goal. They're going to review your security, of course, but the security portion's fairly simple. All right. The first penalty, if they find like you forgot to do an inventory, you forgot this record, or you forgot to do this, could be a letter of admonition. Sometimes there's no action taken by DEA. I mean, it's somewhat subjective. But if it's like, let's just say you forgot to do an inventory, they might give you a letter of admonition, which is just a DEA letter saying, hey, you failed to do this, don't do it again, and continue to practice medicine. I call that similar to like a warning speeding ticket, and that's called an LOA, letter of admonition. The next higher type penalty by DEA that they could give to a registrant would be an MOA, or a memorandum of agreement. They're usually for more violations or more serious violations, and it could be a second violation. So they might come to the same clinic 2 years down the road, then it's more likely they would issue an MOA, and then that's a 3-year period. They're going to list the issues, and they're going to say, hey, we're going to come back in a year and they need to be fixed, or we're going to take this up a notch. So it's kind of like being on a 3-year probation, but again, it's all record keeping. And just like your hand one, Sam, it's that escalating penalty phase, just like most courts do it. The third is an order to show cause. Rarely ever used against a provider, more used against the manufacturer or distributor, but that's actually a legal phrase where they're going to bring you before an administrative law judge employed by DEA. That's the way it works. And they're going to try and say, hey, we're going to take your license away because of continued violations. Now, there's 2 million registrants. DEA only does around 70, 80 of these OTSCs a year. So again, very small amount, more directed at manufacturers, distributors, serious, very serious issues. And then sometimes, just winding it up real quick, sometimes there's a combination of an administrative action and a criminal action. Okay, so it could be administrative in nature. Those are more focused on the registrant's license. Criminal is going to be more personal. A great example of that, a common one, is a pharmacy theft by a pharmacy employee. And then DEA would get notified. And then DEA would show up at that pharmacy. So it's possible either the pharmacist or tech could be charged criminally for the theft or diversion of drugs, but then DEA would look at the pharmacy in totality and say, hey, were your records adequate? Did you prevent this? Could you have prevented this? And is your security tight enough? And if they find any errors in that or weaknesses, there's a possibility that then they could try and convince a federal prosecutor to civilly fine that pharmacy. So that's kind of a common combo way that DEA sees it, more attuned to a pharmacy than any other type practice.
Thank you for that great summary, Dennis. I really appreciate that. I do want to circle back because we had mentioned this earlier about what are some of the red flags that the DEA is looking for when they're potentially going to audit a clinic, which kind of ties in nicely with what you had just spoken about.
Yes, sir. It's usually one of 3 ways or 3 red flags that are the most common, Sam. Number 1 is a drug theft or loss, like I mentioned. That'll usually garner DEA's attention. Sometimes they don't, though, but it all depends. But if a pharmacy is robbed, if there's internal pharmacy theft, if there was ever clinic theft, there's a high likelihood DEA would respond to try and help figure it out to prevent it in the future. The regs say if there's a theft or loss, as a DEA registrant, you're required within 24 hours to report it to DEA and the local police. All right, so that's a common one red flag. So as a practitioner, you don't want to have any thefts or losses, okay? It just brings unneeded attention. Number 2 is an allegation or a complaint. Now, in the pill mill days, we used to get these quite a bit. Sometimes they'd come in from the sheriff or the police chief saying, hey, Dennis, we got this place. For one, we investigated, was open till 4 a.m. in the morning, and the line was 100 deep out the door. And it's like, you guys need to help us. We don't know what to do. We need help. You're the DEA. Come on, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes back then we got complaints or really allegations because you want to be fair and just, but you'd get them from maybe a family member, or even sometimes we used to get them from addiction doctors complaining about a specific pain doctor that was causing too many people to become addicted. So they can come in that way too. So some form of complaint. And every now and then you'd get one from a terminated employee, but that was somewhat rare from a clinic. And then, if you had the time and you really thought something was there, you'd investigate it, or at least you'd look at it. And then the third way is somewhat new, but it's always been out there, is called suspicious order monitoring reports. All right. So in DEA speak, in acronyms like we have, just like you had as an ER doc, that's SOM. And that's a reg that's been 50 years old, but that requires all distributors and manufacturers to report to DEA a suspicious or unusual order of drugs by a DEA registrant. And that's more pronounced nowadays as a result of the nationwide opioid lawsuits. So a number of the manufacturers, distributors have really implemented some tightened systems that they're reporting more to DEA now than they did, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. So one of those three methods, Sam.
Thank you. And, I think I'm on the DEA newsletter, so I do get emails about that SORS, suspicious order report. And then people can, I believe it's mainly pharmacists, manufacturers, distributors, where they can create an online profile to report those. So in a way, they've streamlined that process because it's done online.
If you tuned in to our episode today, chances are you're curious about the ins and outs of starting up a ketamine clinic. It's an exciting field, but let's face it, the journey from idea to actually opening day can be quite daunting. That's why we've created something special for you. Think of it as your personal roadmap, a free downloadable checklist that lays out the essential steps you need to consider when starting up your ketamine clinic. This checklist is designed to help you avoid common pitfalls and launch your trajectory to success. So how can you get your hands on this checklist? Simple. Just visit www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist and grab your free copy today. We've made it easy and accessible because we believe in supporting our community with a valuable resource. ketaminestartup.com/checklist. All right, let's get back to our discussion. Stay tuned and don't forget to download your free checklist during or after the podcast.
This is one of the things that's fascinating to me, is how each state has kind of the state DEA. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So, we have DEA as a federal organization, but in a way they kind of delegate it to the states. So do you notice that some states and the DEA who's responsible for that state or that region, there's varying, enforcement or different priorities? What have you noticed from a state level, even though the DEA is a federal organization?
A lot of it has to do with the culture and the size of the organization, and how many investigators they have. But just about every state has their own state DEA, and oftentimes DEA partners with those agencies. But in my experience, a couple things. One is every state has somewhat of a different culture, and a lot of it's based on the history of drug problems in that state. So let me give you an example. State of Florida. Back in the day, in the late 2000s, up until around 2011, it was crazy Florida pill mill time back then. People were from the Midwest, the Appalachia, were driving down there to buy all the Oxy 30s they could buy. And it was lawful back then that a provider could dispense those drugs out of their office. So there was some wild things in the videos and the stories. It took Florida a few years to get their stuff together. Lawmakers changed some laws, the regs got tighter, and things like that. So Florida in essence, really tightened their stuff up and got, let's say, just strengthened their laws and we're watching things a lot closer. I really can't speak to it now, but I know in some areas before pharmacies open, somebody from the Board of Pharmacy is going to look at that person and be sure he or she's probably a pharmacist and not a truck driver, because that was occurring in Florida. And then the same thing could be said in the states of Ohio, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky as a result of the pill mill issues in the 2000s, in the 2010s in those states. All four of those states implemented various regs and laws and started auditing any agency or clinic that claimed to be a pain clinic. So they really tightened down. So really, they all operate somewhat similarly, but I'd really say you have to look at the history and what they went through because many of those agencies really tightened up their operations.
And I guess that makes a lot of sense because each state will have their own challenges. Like I know, one state may have more issues with cocaine and another may have more with heroin and another one with more meth. So I guess there are regional differences. And I even noticed that in the emergency department where, depending upon where that emergency physician works, they'll deal more with certain types of overdoses versus, like more opioid overdoses in certain areas versus more methamphetamine overdoses. So I guess that makes sense for the DEA to prioritize what specific issue that state is having. You mentioned the biennial and initial inventory. And so biennial, meaning every 2 years, that's actually quite a long time for someone to do an inventory, every 2 years. That sounds, 2 years seems like a long time to go without doing an inventory check. But let's suppose in a hypothetical situation that there's a clinician who is listening to our, conversation and they're like, oh man, I totally was not aware of doing an initial inventory, or, oh my goodness, I've totally wasn't even aware about doing a biannual inventory. What advice would you give for them if they've, done everything else, kept records, et cetera, made sure, they're appropriately wasting and destroying, but they were not aware of it? What advice would you give to them today?
We're all human. My advice would be attempt to create it now if you can. The one thing that's generally accurate about DEA diversion, the actual investigators that do the auditing, if you've got 8 or 9 out of 10 things right in your clinic, they're going to give you a pass. They're human too. They just want to be sure you got the records, the stuff that's not walking out the door and things like that. Because if they're there, if they're actually visiting you, they've received something negative, some sort of negative information why they've knocked on your door in the first place. But, better late than never. We all learn those things, but attempt to create it if you can.
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote that one of my mentors said, and this is just about medicine, is like, he said, strive for perfection, but aim for excellence. And so I think, just recognizing that, people are human beings, and as well as the DEA, it's made up of human beings. I do have a specific question that was asked by one of our audience members. And this one is, let's say that there's a really small clinic and where there's one doctor, because some of these clinics, they're not a high volume where they're seeing a ton of patients. Let's say it's a really, really small micro clinic, if you will, very private practice, and they have one physician and one secretary. So it's one physician, one secretary, and the secretary is not licensed. They do kind of the administrative, telephone calls. How would they go about the witnessing component, whether it's the witnessing the inventory or, the wasting? What are your thoughts on that, Dennis?
The reg doesn't spell out, Sam, that the other witness needs to be a licensed medical provider. So that secretary would be fine. My advice would be, okay, you do the inventory when the secretary's there. You maintain all your waste if you can until you have your witness and things like that. So try and set it up that way. But the next question I often get is like, it's only me and I don't have a witness. That's one of those tough ones. If the only advice I would give, and and it's still up to the DEA person on site, what he or she thinks. But I'd video it then. Get the phone out and video what you're doing to protect yourself. If you've got everything else right, I think you'd be fine. I want to make a habit of doing it by yourself, in the same size. It's just, hey, or can you do it once a week at the end of the day, or you do it when the secretary first comes in the morning? Try and find a way. The reg says you need a witness, and it does not spell out it needs to be any medical license or specific specialty.
Thank you for that clarification. And because when I review some of these regs, it is challenging. It's like, pursuant to regulation 1317.95 and look at it in accordance with 1304.22 parentheses C. So I really appreciate the clarification from your expertise. And moving into kind of like what's been going on these days, and you're definitely probably aware of some of these online companies where they are sending and mailing very large amounts of at-home ketamine use for patients by themselves. What are your thoughts on the DEA's perspective? And of course, you don't represent the DEA; you're no longer working there. But just what's kind of the vibes or the feelings or perspective that you've noticed?
You got it. I'm going to go back to your last statement. I too have times challenges reading those regs and interpreting those. Okay, so you're not the only one, and it's like I often think it's like, who's writing this stuff? Okay, but it is what it is, and things like that. And the good thing is, usually DEA will point you to reg, and the black and white ones are easy to understand. The gray ones are subject to interpretation. So you're not the only one. Okay. Online ketamine therapy with lozenges and things like that. I think there's a degree of risk there, but I think it's small. And here's how I'm going to make that argument. DEA and DOJ have been looking at some of these larger telehealth organizations. In 2022, they investigated Cerebral and Dun Global. Both of these were telehealth organizations nationwide, primarily doing ADHD type medicines. I don't think really anything came as a result of it too much. I think Cerebral might have quit prescribing, but really what it came down to is I think DEA and DOJ was questioning the legitimacy or the time spent, and they were getting their information from actual providers complaining that worked at these agencies, that they were being pressured to fill these prescriptions. That's what I've garnered by reading the news clips. So however accurate the news clips is. So there's been some movement by DEA. I didn't see anything substantial come out of the back of it. Now, with that being said, the administrator DEA recently came out and mentioned the Matthew Perry case, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But in the same regard, when she spoke about that day, she mentioned there's 108,000 overdose deaths tied to methamphetamine and fentanyl during 2022. Most of those are going to be fentanyl, but the amount of overdose deaths in methamphetamine and cocaine have been climbing too, because the traffickers are putting fentanyl into both of those drugs. As far as I know, been one overdose death tied to ketamine, and that's the one with most of the press, and that's Matthew Perry. Now, I know for almost a certain fact, DEA is going to continue to focus on illicit fentanyl, the cartels, and the Chinese manufacturers and all of that, and rightfully so, to save lives with that many deaths. However, I see too that this new online ketamine way provides, or at least in my opinion and my history in pill mills, there's a degree of risk there. And I was working with somebody not too long ago, and he or she was licensed in all 50 states, and they were treating people in all 50 states. And they were kind of lambasting one medical board in a couple of these states would not give them a license once they found out what they were doing. So I'm not sure what that answer is. And then I'll wind it up, Sam, is the telemedicine. It's my understanding from the most recent research, that exemption, that COVID exemption, which allows it, is going to continue on for the next year. So I guess in summary, I'm really not sure what the future is going to hold. I see ketamine therapy, from my experience as a former agent, in a clinic like yourselves, to be the practice of medicine under the care, low risk. It's supported by a number of medical universities that I've seen that do the same thing. I think at a University of Michigan, Columbia, Yale, the Ohio State, and many more. This online stuff, my gut tells me at some point, if something negative happens, like an overdose death or a bad compound, DEA or DOJ is going to come in there on whoever that happens. But I'm, again, going off my feel and the history of them moving against some of these telehealth and the way they operate. But again, strictly my opinion, Sam.
Thank you for that wisdom and insight, especially from your, all of your years with the DEA. I want to shift gears. And so you and I were recording probably, 20 days or so from the upcoming elections. And what is the political impact or influence that the president and Congress may have to the DEA, if any?
You got it. I don't see in DA's effect any at all, mainly because big DEA, as I call it, they're laser focused on the illicit fentanyl that's killing all the kids across America and things like that I mentioned. That's where the deaths are. Now, the one thing I do see, whatever party takes over, they're going to have to address this telehealth, this exemption, because DEA has never put out this special exemption. And then I hear from some of the old DEA people, like from my era, some argue we're almost going through the same thing that happened in the 2000s, which created the Ryan-Haight Act. And for your listeners that don't know, the Ryan-Haight Act kind of forced DEA into medicine somewhat by when Congress passed the Ryan-Haight Act in 2008. It said before you have to go hands-on. There must be an in-person visit with that patient before you can prescribe drugs, okay? And then Ryan-Haight, give the listeners a little history, he was a 19-year-old California young man who ordered hydrocodone off the internet from a illegal pharmacy, and the doctor that approved it did it on a mouse click and was paid $20. It was mailed right to his house, and the young man overdosed and died. And then his mom stood up, like you'd think any parent would, and at with Congress to get that. And when COVID came, the exemption then went out, and there's really no requirement now for an in-person visit. So it's kind of opened up. Wild West wouldn't be the right thing, but it's just opened up a new arena. And there's a huge support by telehealth companies and all sorts of people out there that said, hey, we need to continue to do this. And then DA's kind of caught in the middle. How do they make a reg that makes everybody happy? And who's ever the next president, they're going to probably have to deal with that. And DA's probably going to have to put a reg out and see if it'll fly. The last time they put out a proposed reg in, I believe, early 2023, they took 38,000 comments in on that reg. And I often tell people it almost like crashed the system. I think that was the world record for comments on DA. So it's a hot button issue. And, there's pros and cons to it like anything else. But it's almost like, okay, we saw this again 20 years ago, but maybe there's a better way to do it now. So we're not, reenacting what happened to Ryan-Haight and some of these other young kids and things like that.
Thank you for that in-depth answer, and especially the history of the Ryan-Haight Act. I've heard of it and I'm familiar with it, but I didn't know that it was based upon the 19-year-old Ryan-Haight who overdosed. That's a really sad story. But I'm glad there's been some, positive changes from that with the new regulation. So what is one piece of advice, Dennis, that you would give to someone who is thinking about starting up a ketamine clinic? So they don't have one yet, but they're just like pondering and saying, hey, maybe this is something I would do or can do and open one up. What's the one piece of advice you'd give? And in particular, from kind of the DEA regulation perspective?
Okay. Well, I'll give you that. And some of the other things I learned from my pill mill way.
Sure.
One is find a mentor that knows about ketamine therapy. 2, follow a general guideline. I'm familiar with your organization. You're a part of their SAM ASKP, but Yale, Columbia, the Ohio State, University of Michigan, follow an accepted guideline. And I'm outside my area of expertise, but it protects you. Okay, it gives you the roadmap, plus with the mentor and maybe the professional organization. I often tell people the practice of medicine is really not controlled by DEA. DEA is just the enforcement arm. The practice of medicine is controlled by teaching medical universities, professional organizations, and medical boards. So if you have a great guideline, best practice way to do it, it really protects you and gives you that roadmap. And then lastly, set up a good security and record-keeping system, a good foundation. So if DA would ever knock on your door, which is going to be super low odds, your record-keeping and security are gold standard. And that's really the 3 things you got to do, in my opinion.
Thank you for that, Dennis. And actually, I am on the committee at American Society of Ketamine Physicians to create those guidelines, because there are some guidelines, but we're working on publishing guidelines where people can know, hey, these are kind of the boundaries, or these are the bowling lanes, and these are the bumpers where you want to be in. So we're working on that actively right now. Any other ideas? Anything that we missed? Anything that you want to share with the audience before we wrap up?
The difference between drug destruction and drug wasting. Okay. This is a perfect example of, as you mentioned, Sam, of like these freaking regs will confuse a person. Okay. And it's like, who writes this stuff? But anyway, drug destruction, when you destroy drugs, and an example that would be expired meds. Let's say you dropped the vial on the floor and you broke it. You want to record that destruction on a DEA 41 form. And if, let's say, you don't have a form, write yourself an email and get the form later or whatever. But that'll help that adjust your inventory to match out. When you waste, in a perfect example of this, because with the ketamine clinics I've worked with, sometimes there isn't that much wasting, and sometimes there is. But if my information's right, an ophthalmologist might waste on every patient. So for instance, with the ophthalmology group I've worked with in the past, they're using fentanyl and Versed while they're doing, and there's a standard dose, but sometimes they won't use the entire dose in that syringe. So it seems like in those instances, they're wasting on every patient. You don't need the DEA 41 form. You just need to document that with the amount on your own form. And again, I'm going back 50 years and I'm guessing, but I think the intent by the lawmakers were, it's like, hey, they don't want you filling out a 41 form when you're doing daily wasting on a patient. So create your own record, and there's a simpler way to do it, and then document it that way. You just need to, the amount and who witnessed the wasting. That's really all you need. But that is a confusing one. The other question that often comes up is any additional cases like this Dr. Smith or Matthew Perry that I'm aware of. To stay current, I attempt to track every medical case in America just about every day. And I have to stay current to be good at what I do. I'm aware of Dr. Smith in South Carolina, but I've only read the news article, and that's limited. So I really have no additional information. The Matthew Perry case and the 2 doctors that were charged in that case is a great example of what I mean by there would be no DEA involvement unless there's probably that overdose and then that diversion of drugs. DEA would have never knocked on their doors with the LAPD. So that's a prime example of, like, you never want that to happen to your clinic. And then from my review of the facts, that's a classic case of the diversion of drugs by those providers who were operating outside the practice of legitimate medicine. And that's what the government must prove. And that's sometimes difficult to prove. And then lastly, the only other ketamine case I've heard or seen or read about, there's a provider up in Montana that got civilly fined $85,000 for lack of record keeping for his ketamine therapy practice. And from the court record I've read, he is going to keep any records of anything, Sam. So, and then somehow DEA got onto him. I'm not sure how. The court record didn't say that. But when DEA went in, they looked at all his records and he really was absent. He had no records. And I think he was storing things at his house when his practice, was down the street or something like that, which is a big no-no too. So just sounded like a mess of records on that one. But really, that's the only ones I've heard about.
And I want to ask you some rapid fire, kind of just some fun questions. So the first one is, if you could only have one book, one movie, and one type of food with you on a deserted island, what would they be?
Well, the food would be pizza. The book would be the most recent military survival guide, because I'd be one to get my butt off that island as quick as I could. And then it's like, give me a Robinson Crusoe movie, because I might glean something from that too, Sam. So that would be my focus.
Beautiful. If you could go back in time for a day, where and when would you go?
I go back, like, I think it's 1989 when I met my wife at a social event. So that's probably where I go back to and kind of enjoy that night a little bit more.
Oh, that's so sweet. If you had a billboard that would be seen by millions of people, what would that billboard say?
To help somebody up today.
All right, Dennis, that is awesome. It's been such a pleasure talking with you, and I truly appreciate you sharing your unique expertise, your wisdom, your insights, that level of transparency and the energy that you bring into this space. It's profound. So next, where can people find out about you, your consulting, if they want a consultation for their clinic just to make sure they're on the up and up? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Either on my website at Prescription Drug Consulting, or text or call me at my phone number of 312-859-2430. Repeating, 312-859-2430.
Awesome. And we'll put in the links and the show notes so that people, if you don't have the time to write that down, or if you're listening in the car, you can just check the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation about a very important topic related to starting and running your own ketamine clinic. The fact that you are listening to episodes like this shows your commitment to helping others with this transformational treatment. It's always gratifying to share insights with dedicated professionals like you, and we hope you found this discussion as enjoyable and informative as we did. Don't forget to catch our next episode, where we'll continue doing a deep dive into this exciting and expanding field. As always, please leave a 5-star review on your favorite platform that you listen to or watch this on, and we will see you soon. Bye.